Our penultimate chapter is Foundations of Organizational Structure. Organizational behavior partially, of course, depends on the structure of the organization. So, organizational structure has a lot of different sub-elements, and I'll quickly define them over here. Work specialization, in other words, who does what? Is one person specializing in accounting, and one person in marketing, and one person in operations, and one person in human resources? Departmentalization. If you have two or three people in your organization, you probably don't have too much departmentalization, but if you have 30 or 40 employees or more, well, maybe some of them work in human resources, and some of them work in sales, and some of them work in marketing, and some of them work in manufacturing, and some of them work in accounting, etc., etc. A chain of command, in other words, who works for whom and who has the final word on various elements. You have a span of control, who controls what. Does the person who controls human resources may not have the ability to allocate money or budgets or things like that. Centralization, the idea of having all the control centered in a small group of people or even one person who's a CEO, or the opposite, decentralization, where you have one person who's completely in charge of the budget, and one person who's completely in charge of marketing, and the chief marketing officer has nothing to do with budgets, and the chief, person who does the accounting has nothing to do with human resources. And formalization, the extent and the idea to which you formalize this process, or alternatively, leave it informal. Leave it in a situation. Some small companies don't necessarily have everybody with their specific title and their little fiefdom and their little domain. Instead, they just kind of all work together on things. So, like in everything else, there are there are good and bad ways to handle various things, and you can't always look at it as a cookie cutter situation. It really depends on the company, depends on the people there, depends on the type of company, the goals, etc. Okay, so some of the key questions in terms of organization: to what degrees are activities subdivided into separate jobs? In other words, you're not going to have one person who sweeps the floors and runs the company's books, although you might, depending on the size of the company. But the way to make sure that you do this in the most efficient way is work specialization. This person does the accounting. This person doesn't do the sweeping up the floors. On what basis will jobs be grouped together? In other words, who works for whom? Does this person work in accounting, or does this person work in marketing? Does this person work in sales? Does this person work in customer service? Well, that's based on departmentalization. Put a person in a particular department. That doesn't necessarily mean that a person in sales can't do some accounting, and a person in accounting can't do some, floor sweeping or holiday party planning, but it just means that a person should fundamentally belong to one particular department. To whom do individuals report, which means who works under whom? Do I work for the CEO directly? Do I work for the chief marketing officer? Do I work for somebody who is dealing with customer service? How many individuals can a manager efficiently direct? A span of control. That's the span of control, which is, in other words, how many people can one person supervise effectively. You don't, if you have 50 people in the group, you don't have one person, you don't want to have one person directly supervising all 50. It's just too much to deal with. Maybe you have that one person supervise 10 people, and those 10 people each supervise 5 more people. Where does the decision-making authority lie? Who has the final responsibility and the final say on these things? And that's the issue of centralization and decentralization. Do you consolidate all the power in one or a few individuals? Do you spread it out over a much larger number of individuals? That's that question. And of course, formalization deals with to what degree will there be rules and regulations to direct all people there? How much formalization do you do? Are you going to have everything based on an employee handbook, or are you going to deal with things as they come up on an individual basis? So now let's look into each of these in a little bit more detail. We just kind of gave you a little bit of an overview with the chart that's discussed all these things. Work specialization, which was the first element over here on our organizational structure chart, is the degree to which activities and organizations are subdivided into separate jobs. This is, the DOL, the division of labor, which says, you do this that you're good at, and that person will do that she's good at. Obviously, the benefit is greater efficiency and lower costs. You don't want people that are being paid to direct marketing or direct accounting to also be sweeping the floors, where somebody could be paid one third of that or one fourth of that and still do the same job. Now, the costs of that, there are, none of these things, some of these things are double-edged sword. These aren't all guaranteed to be 100% benefit. Human costs, when carried too far, the idea that if people won't do things that they're needed, it's one thing to be specialized and to say, well, I'm in accounting, but now if that person, if there's no accounting that day that needs to be done, and instead there is hauling boxes onto trucks that needs to be done that way, ideally, you'd like to allocate your resources rather than that person twiddling his thumbs all day and doing nothing. If that person could help out with other people, that would help as well. On the other hand, if you want to avoid that cost, you can give the person a larger job so that the person will have less downtime. Sometimes, for example, let's say compliance work may be very heavy when the government is doing an audit, but then when the government is not doing an audit, the person may have a lot of downtime. If you give that person extra jobs, you give that person more responsibilities in a little bit unrelated areas, or somewhat related areas, that could decrease that particular issue. But again, ideally, you'd like to have people, when they have downtime, help other people in other departments. Okay, let's take a look at the second one, which is departmentalization, which is the basis by which jobs are grouped together. In other words, how do we define departments? There's obviously many different types of departments in a company: human resources, accounting, sales, customer service, production, manufacturing, marketing. These are all different aspects that many companies have to do. Of course, not all companies have to do this. Some companies don't manufacture things, they just resell them. Some companies don't need to deal with human resources because they're small enough not to have to worry about it. But still, departmentalizing means building departments that are based on particular tasks, based on function. What kind of work are they doing? What product or service are they selling? If there's a big company like Amazon, there might be a book department and a video department and a DVD department, a furniture department. There might be different departments that deal with different specialized type of areas. Even though they all might be in sales, there might be one sales department for books and one sales department for videos and one sales department for furniture and one sales department for automobile parts, whatever it is. You could base it on geography. We've got a northeast sales department, we've got a southwest sales department, etc. The process by which they actually operate, in other words, different parts of the organization might do sales in a different way. Some might go door to door, and some might do internet advertising, and some might go to trade shows. You can departmentalize based on that, and you can departmentalize based on customer type. You could have sales representatives that focus on individuals. You could have sales representatives that focuses on other businesses, sales representatives that focus on school districts, government contracts, etc. And you can do departmentalization based on some of these or all of these. Huge companies, like Amazon, might do all of these. You might have a department that sells books to school districts in Washington State. That does all of them. It's based on function, sales, product or service, books, geography, Washington State, process, let's say that sells by calling, and customer type, because it only sells to school districts. Whereas other companies, you might departmentalize based on some of these, but not others. Now let's take a look at some of the others on that list. We've got chain of command, which is an unbroken line of authority that extends from the top all the way to the bottom, theoretically. The top of the person on the chain of command will be the chairman of the board of directors, or the CEO, or the president. And as you go further down in the chain of command, you're decreasing the authority of each individual. Authority meaning positional rights, which means the right to tell other people what to do based on your position in the organization. And unity of command, which really means to have one individual that has the ultimate authority over decision making. Few organizations find this relevant based on the idea that organizations are much more decentralized today. You've got people working all over the country. You've got people working in companies that do so many different things. Smaller companies. So chain of command are not as relevant. Then a similar concept is span of control, which is the number of employees that one person can manage. One person may not be able to manage 100 different people. One person may be able to manage 5 people, and each of those people can go manage 5 more, something like that. The trend is towards wider spans of control, and and really the reason is because of the increased ability of communications in today's day and age. In the old days, if you were controlling people, you had to have an office that was within walking distance or easy, a short, maybe even talking distance of where your office was. Where in today's day and age, you can work with a lot of people by email. You can work with people in different geographic areas. You can do all sorts of things. That just makes it a lot easier to control people who work under you. And this is just an example of, obviously, in a very big company, of how bigger spans of control can mean that you need less managers. If you have 4,000 employees, well, if you have a span of 8, which means each manager controls 8 underlings, so you've got the CEO, which controls 8 people on the second level, and then you've got each of those 8 controls another 8, and you get down to the 4,000 people in only 1, 2, 3, 4 levels. Whereas if you have a span of 4, which means each manager only controls 4 people, well, then you're going to have 7 levels, because the CEO can only control 4 people, and then 4 to 16, 16 to 64. And again, as the communication technology gets more and more efficient, you can have these greater spans of control, and therefore you need fewer managers. Like I think I mentioned earlier in this course, AT&T, when my father used to work for them, they had 8 levels of management. Now, obviously, AT&T was a huge company, but that's a lot of levels, and that's just managers. That doesn't even include people who work, and going and taking out the coins from telephone booths in those days. If you're not sure what a telephone booth is, you're probably under 20 years old or or whatever it is. But the point is that the thing is, there were a lot of managers. Today, the companies are generally smaller. They're less management oriented, and fewer managers can control more people as you get further down in the chain of command. Then you've got centralization and decentralization, which is the degree to which the decision-making process is concentrated at a single point. That includes the positional rights of the person who is given the authority to make these decisions. Decentralization, on the other hand, is where the frontline employees, the people in the field, so to speak, make their own decisions. You have a salesperson who's out there making a sales call. Well, the salesperson might have the authority to change things up a little bit, make the pitch a little bit different, make a deal with the client, make a special deal to give the client a discount or to do something that increases sales. Whereas more centralization would require that salesperson to go approve it with the supervisor before making a deal. Decentralization is more towards the idea of giving the person in the field the flexibility to make decisions as they come along. Obviously, the advantage to centralization is that you don't want people going rogue and making their own decisions that aren't going to be best for the company. But on the other hand, the advantage of decentralization is giving people in the field, the flexibility to do things as they come up. And finally, we've got formalization, which is this degree to which jobs are standardized. Formal means everybody's got to do precisely what their job entails. They don't have a lot of discretion. They have to do specifically a particular task. It may be written in an employee handbook. It may be written in procedures. Informal, again, gives people more freedom to act, and as you can probably imagine from what we discussed in terms of centralization, the trend is to give people a little bit more flexibility and to decrease formalization. So now let's look at the actual structures themselves and some common organizational designs. And this, as with many other things we've learned about in this course, is not ironclad. It's the sort of thing that does vary from organization to organization, and there can be combinations of these. The structure of an organization could be simple, bureaucratic, or something called the matrix structure, which we'll learn a little bit about later on. The simple is the easiest to understand. The simple is the most basic and the first structure. The structure has a low degree of departmentalization, which means that you basically focus a hierarchy. You have the CEO, and the CEO supervises a couple of people. This is usually the best, especially for small companies. There are wide spans of control. You don't departmentalize it as much. It's really the same thing as saying. Authority centralized in a single person, usually a president or CEO. And there's not that much in terms of formalization. Basically, when people are not sure what to do, they're told specifically what to do by their supervisor, who runs right up on up to the CEO. It's difficult to maintain in bigger organizations because you can imagine that there might be a lot of confusion if you have 100 employees or 150 employees and they're all kind of reporting to the same structure. There just might not be enough time that the supervisor has to to run every little department. Then you've got the bureaucracy, which is the opposite. The bureaucracy is highly routine and achieved through specialization. Formal rules and regulations, trying to tell everybody precisely what they need to do to fulfill their job. Centralized authority in one or central organizational group. Narrow spans of control. Rather than having people control many different departments, you have, the chief marketing officer controlling only marketing. The human resources manager controlling only human resources. And these are tasked by functional departments, like we saw before, which can be divided along many different dimensions, along product, along process, along task, etc., and the decision making along the chain of command. The matrix structure is kind of a combination, but what it does is it establishes departments for every group based on task. Rather than looking at it in terms of on this slide, I think it's a little easier to look at it in terms of a chart, because this, it's a chart and really it's a matrix. This would be an example for a College of Business Administration. So, you might have different departments: accounting department, finance department, decision and information systems department, marketing management, and then you could have each aspect of the college. People would be in charge of the undergraduate and with master's, PhD, research, community service. So, for example, you'd have one department where somebody's in charge of the finance education of the master's program, and another department that's involved in research of the management department. So you've got how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You've got 30 different departments because you've got 6 dimensions on each level over here. That would be an example of a matrix which combines a functional with a product department. I guess these would be the products and these would be the functions. And each one would have a subdepartment based on each level over here. The matrix is not necessarily a contradiction with bureaucracy. On the contrary, matrix almost takes the bureaucracy to the next level. And we finish off the chapter with various other options that are relevant to design companies that are more relevant today than they used to be because of technology, but which are still also possibilities in terms of how to manage and structure an organization. First of all, we've got virtual organizations, which is an organization which is very non-traditional but still can work, which is something that outsources its major business functions. In other words, rather than manufacturing and producing and selling, you hire one company to manufacture, and then you hire another company to sell, and you hire another company to do your accounting, and theoretically you can run an entire organization selling things on eBay or whatever it is with one person, and just you outsource everything else. It provides maximum flexibility while concentrating on what the organization does best. Maybe what you do best is sales, so you outsource everything else. You have other people manufacture, and other people package, and other people follow up with customer service, and the only thing you worry about is sales. But on the other hand, obviously you have reduced control. When you outsource and you give these functions to other people, you rely on them to do what's necessary for the best of the organization, and you don't have as much control over them. A virtual organization example would be an executive group. In other words, the people running the whole show. That could be one person, and they hire an advertising agency to market, and they hire an independent research and developing firm to develop their materials. They hire factories in Asia to actually produce their stuff. They commission salespeople to actually sell their things. In fact, it's really just a couple of people in the middle making the decisions, and everything else is outsourced. And the people to whom they're outsourced, of course, are being paid individually for these services that they render. A boundaryless organization, similar to a virtual organization, really a virtual organization is a type of boundaryless organization. It does a lot of havoc. It wreaks a lot of havoc with all the traditional organizational principles that we've discussed so far in this chapter. It eliminates the chain of command. There really is no chain of command because you don't have one person working beneath someone else and beneath someone else. You just have the outsourced workers working directly for management. You have limitless spans of control. One person can really control the outsourcing of an entire manufacturing. You might outsource to a factory in China that might have 1,000 employees, so theoretically, when it comes to your particular product that's being manufactured, your control has to span thousands of people. It replaces departments with empowered teams, in other words, teams that have the control over particular decisions in terms of executing a particular plan. And of course, it breaks down geographical barriers. You don't all have to be in the same building. You could be in New York, and the person that you're controlling might be in Taiwan. And then you have the other side of the organizational chart, and that is unfortunately something that many companies have to go through in various ways, and that is downsizing. Downsizing essentially is laying people off. This is a systematic effort to make the organization leaner by selling off business units, by closing locations, and by essentially laying people off, by firing people. Now, obviously, you don't want to have to do this. It has a negative impact on employees. The employees that are there might feel a little bit less secure. It might engender a negative attitude. The people who are downsized are people that have experience in your organization, and you're losing all the experience that you put into them. But unfortunately, it may just be necessary. I mean, there are different philosophies in terms of downsizing. There are some people who will tell you that downsizing is good. That even if you don't need to save money, just cutting off the bottom 10% of your workforce in terms of productivity, in terms of basically firing the worst 10% of your employees and hiring them with new people. Sorry about that. Just had to pick up the phone. The point is, downsizing, as I was saying, is some people think that just firing the bottom 10% of your employees just to replace them in the normal scheme of things is a good idea, although some people will tell you that that's not a good idea, and most companies don't usually do that, although some big companies actually do. But downsizing certainly is something that is part of the life cycle of all business organizations at one point or another. And we finish off the chapter by looking at two different models of organizational design. There's the more bureaucratic model on the left, the mechanistic model, the one that puts everybody into a structure, high specialization. You have different departments, and each department has different managers, and each manager has different sub-managers, etc. High formalization. Really, the left one is the more traditional model of the organization. The right one is kind of the organic model where you kind of let things grow as they grow. Brand new company may start growing, and people might work together out of necessity or out of habit or because they get along with each other or for whatever reason. How do you determine what structure to use? We've seen a lot of different structures. We've seen a bureaucratic structure. We've seen a more general, looser structure. We've seen a virtual structure. Well, you got to look at many different factors. You got to look at the strategy of the organization, the strategy of innovation. How much innovation do you want? Do you just want to produce as much as possible, or do you want to produce new goods? Google, for example, is famous for having a tremendously innovative strategy where they're willing to sacrifice a little productivity in order to generate new ideas. They tell their employees, go spend a certain amount of your time trying to think of new ideas, even if you're not actually working and actually producing, because it's from those people thinking that they're going to get their new big ideas. Cost minimization strategy. Cost control prefers mechanistic structures because you have much more control over the workers and what they're doing in terms of what they're productive at. Imitation strategy is based on the idea of looking what other people in the industry are doing and following what they're doing. Orientation size. As size increases, you have to move a little, per force, you have to move a little bit more to a mechanistic model, simply based on the idea that if your organization is big enough, you need structure. You can't have one person running 100 different employees. Technology. Technology is the more technology you use in the office and that you're able to use, the less structured and the less mechanistic you have to be, because people can be managed and run from remotely. And finally, in dynamic environment of an organization leads to structures that, in dynamic meaning moving around. Dynamic in general means movement. So a dynamic structure where people move around in terms of, not physically necessarily, but in terms of what they're doing, leads to structures that are less mechanistic. Okay, now we just summarize the chapter over here. You can't generalize any particular link between structure and performance, which means essentially you have to figure out what's best for your company. So you need to consider all of these different things. You need to consider specialization, how much control your employees can have, centralization, your national culture, of course, cultures that are more collectivistic, like things that are more mechanistic, that are less loose. Whereas cultures that are more individualistic, you're likely to have more organic structures. And that is pretty much all for this chapter. I will see you next in the last chapter.